Imagine waking up before the sun has even bothered to rise. That particular hour when the world is still wrapped in a kind of sacred silence, when the air smells like damp stone and old prayers, and when you feel somehow that something important is about to happen. That was me 3 years ago, in a small rented room in a city I had barely learned to pronounce, sitting across from a man named Zebulun. He was 81 years old. He had hands like the bark of an ancient tree, cracked, darkened, layered with decades of work and weather. He had survived things I will not name. He had buried people I will not mention. And somehow through all of it, he had arrived at a kind of peace that I had never seen on a living face before. I was not at peace. I was 29, carrying the specific weight of someone who has tried everything and succeeded at nothing. I had launched 3 small businesses, each one dying quietly like a candle in a storm. I had studied finance, worked 70-hour weeks for a company that dissolved like sugar in the rain, and accumulated a debt that followed me everywhere like a second shadow. I was not suffering dramatically. I was suffering in the ordinary, invisible way that most people suffer, just slightly below the level where anyone bothers to notice. Zebulun noticed. I had met him through a distant relative, a man named Pinchas, who described him as someone who understands how things actually work. I expected wisdom. I expected philosophy. I expected something I could write in a notebook and forget 6 weeks later. I did not expect salt. Zebulun placed a small clay bowl on the table between us. In it was salt, but not the kind you find in a supermarket shaker. This was coarse, unrefined, grayish-white, almost luminous in the low light of his kitchen. It looked ancient. It looked intentional. It looked like something that had been waiting. He said nothing for a long moment. That was his method. Long silences before important things, as if the silence was a kind of preparation, a sweeping of the floor before a guest arrives. Then he said, "Do you know what salt is?" I said I thought I did. He smiled, which meant I did not. What followed over the next 4 hours was not a lecture. It was more like a door being slowly opened onto a room I had not known existed inside my own mind. He spoke about salt in a way I had never heard anyone speak about anything, not as a condiment, not as a preservative, not as a mineral compound, but as a concept, a principle, a technology developed over thousands of years by people who understood something fundamental about the relationship between scarcity and preservation, between value and permanence, between what rots and what endures. I want to share with you what Zebulun shared with me. Not word for word. He spoke in a mix of languages I only partially understood, and his references were layered with history I am still unpacking years later. But the core of it, the essential truth that changed how I think about money, about time, about the whole project of building a life, that I can give you. And I promise you, by the time you reach the end of this, something in the way you see your own situation will have shifted. Not because I am extraordinary, but because what Zebulun taught me is extraordinary, and it has been hiding in plain sight for thousands of years. Let's go back to the beginning. Salt in the ancient world was not seasoning, it was survival. Civilizations were built around access to it. Wars were fought over deposits of it. Trade routes stretching thousands of kilometers existed for the sole purpose of moving it from where it was found to where it was needed. Roman soldiers were reportedly paid in it, which is where we get the word salary. The word salvation shares the same Latin root. So does salute. Health, greeting, redemption, all of them connected linguistically and historically to this single white crystal. Why? Because salt does one thing that nothing else in the ancient world could do consistently, reliably, across all climates and cultures. Salt stops decay. Meat without salt rots within days. Meat with salt can survive months, sometimes years. Fish caught in one season can feed a family through the next. The difference between a community that starves and a community that endures is often nothing more than access to this one mineral. Zebulun looked at me when he said this and let the silence breathe again. Then he said, "The problem most people have with money is not that they cannot earn it, it is that they have no salt." I sat with that for a moment. He continued, "Every financial tradition that has endured across generations," he told me, "contains within it some version of this salt principle. The names change, the rituals change, the cultural packaging changes entirely, but the core technology, the thing that separates people who accumulate wealth from people who perpetually start over, is always the same. It is the capacity to stop decay, not to earn more, not to invest brilliantly, not to predict markets or ride trends or discover some hidden shortcut. Those things matter, but they are secondary. The first and most foundational skill is stopping the rot. And most of us, he said, have been taught almost nothing about this. Think about your own life for a moment. Think about the money that has passed through your hands over the last 5 years. If I asked you to account for it, not the big purchases, not the obvious expenses, but the full picture, could you do it? Could you trace where it went, how it moved, what it became? Most people cannot. Not because they are careless or unintelligent, but because nobody taught them to apply the salt. Nobody showed them how to stop the decay before it begins. In the Jewish tradition that Zevulun was raised in, salt appears at the table not as a habit, but as a reminder. Bread is dipped in salt before it is eaten. The salt is always present. It is not hidden in the pantry. It sits in the open, visible, intentional. A daily confrontation with the question, what are you preserving? What are you letting rot? He told me that his father had explained it to him this way. Salt on the table means you never forget that everything temporary can become permanent if you treat it correctly, and everything permanent can decay if you abandon it. I wrote that down. I have read it hundreds of times since. Now here is where it gets practical, because I know that beautiful metaphors are satisfying for about 40 seconds, and then they dissolve unless they connect to something real. The SALT principle, applied to personal finance, looks like this. The first layer, identifying the decay. Most financial advice focuses on growth. Earn more, invest more, compound more. But Zevulun's tradition starts somewhere different. It starts by asking, where is the rot already happening? For most people, rot shows up in 3 places. The first is invisible spending, money that leaves without being witnessed. Subscriptions, convenience purchases, small automated charges that collectively drain significant amounts because they never rise to the level of conscious decision. The SALT principle says, nothing leaves without being seen. Every exit is witnessed. You do not have to prevent all spending. You simply have to see it. The second place rot appears is in delayed action. This is the rot of good intentions. The account you meant to open, the investment you planned to start, the insurance you kept meaning to sort out. Each week of delay is a week of decay. Zevulun said that in his tradition, the salting of meat had to happen quickly after slaughter, not eventually, not when convenient, but immediately, because decay does not wait for convenience. The third form of rot is what he called the erosion of standards. This is the most dangerous and the hardest to see. It is what happens when you slowly, incrementally lower what you expect from yourself and your situation. Each small surrender feels reasonable in the moment, but over time, the compound effect of lowered standards is catastrophic. You look up 5 years later and you are living a life you would not have chosen. Not because of any single bad decision, but because of 1,000 moments of salting too little. He told me about a man in his community named Gershom, a brilliant man, genuinely gifted, who had spent 40 years never quite arriving where he wanted to be. Not because of bad luck, not because of external circumstances, but because Gershom had a habit of accepting just slightly less than he had aimed for. Every year, the gap between where he was and where he had intended to be widened by just a little. He kept adjusting the target downward rather than adjusting his effort upward. That, Zevulun said, is the most heartbreaking form of decay. Not the dramatic collapse, but the slow, gentle, almost imperceptible lowering of the bowl. I felt that somewhere deep when he said it, because I recognized it. I had been Gershom, not entirely, not irreparably, but in some essential way, I had been quietly negotiating with my own ambitions, gradually accepting less, gradually expecting less, gradually salting less. The second layer of the SALT principle, application. In the ancient ritual, salt was applied in specific quantities, in specific ways, at specific times, not randomly, not impulsively. The process was structured because the goal was preservation, and preservation requires consistency over inspiration. Zevulun told me that the biggest mistake modern people make with money is that they manage it emotionally rather than ritually. They engage with their finances when they feel like it, when they are anxious, when there is a crisis, but not consistently, not calmly, not as a daily practice. The tradition he described, and which he had practiced for over 60 years, involved what he called the 4 accounts of salt. These were not literally accounts in the modern banking sense, though they could map onto them. They were more like categories of intentional separation. The first account was for seed, money set aside specifically for future growth, never touched for current expenses, treated as sacred in the same way the salted offering in the ancient temple was treated. You did not eat it. You did not borrow from it. It existed for its designated purpose, and only for that purpose. The second account was for sustenance, the money that covers your real needs, structured honestly, not inflated by wants dressed up as necessities. This account was supposed to feel slightly tight, not dangerously so, but intentionally constrained, because constraint is what gives things form. The third account was for sharing, and this is where Zebulun's tradition diverged most dramatically from most Western financial thinking. A portion, he said his family always used 10%, but the number is less important than the practice, was designated specifically to give away, not out of guilt, not out of charity in the condescending sense, but because, he said, the act of giving consistently does something to your relationship with money that cannot be replicated any other way. It breaks the psychological grip of scarcity. It trains you, over time, to experience yourself as someone who has enough to share. And that experience, repeated and repeated, eventually becomes the truth. The fourth account was for pleasure, and this might seem frivolous, but it is not. Zebulun said that any system of preservation that contains no joy becomes a kind of prison. The purpose of preserving wealth is not to possess it, but to use it, eventually, for something that makes life richer. The fourth account gives you permission to enjoy the fruits of the discipline without guilt, because it is designated, planned, intentional. You are not splurging impulsively. You are executing a plan. The difference in how it feels is enormous. I started this system the week I returned home from visiting Zebulun. I am not going to pretend it transformed my finances overnight. It did not. The first month I was clumsy with it. I miscategorized things. I was overly rigid and then overcorrected into being too loose. The second month was better. By the third month, something quiet had shifted, not in my bank balance, but in my relationship with money, which is the thing that was actually broken. Now let me tell you what happened over the following year and a half, because this is where the story gets stranger. By applying the SALT principle, by simply stopping the rot, by making every financial movement visible and intentional, my situation began to change. Not because of some mysterious force, because of compounding clarity. When you stop leaking money invisibly, more remains. When more remains, you have more to apply to the seed account. When the seed account grows, even slowly, you have more options. When you have more options, you begin to make better decisions. Because decisions made from abundance, even modest abundance, are structurally different from decisions made from scarcity and panic. I also did something else that Zebulun had encouraged, which I had not expected him to bring up. He told me to study how the ritual of salting was done, specifically the timing. In the ancient method, meat was soaked in water first, then salted, then rinsed. The sequence mattered. You could not skip steps. And the soaking phase, the phase before the salt was even applied, was about softening the surface so that the salt could penetrate deeply, rather than just sitting on the outside. He said most people, when they encounter good financial advice, apply it superficially. They hear the principle, they like it, they do it once or twice, and then old habits reassert themselves because the advice never soaked in. It sat on the surface. It did not penetrate. Before you change what you do, he told me, you have to change what you believe is possible for you, and that requires soaking. That requires time spent in a new way of thinking before you rush to the application. I spent 2 months reading, listening, and deliberately soaking myself in accounts of people who had built wealth from very little. Not lottery stories, not startup unicorn stories, but quiet, ordinary stories of men and women who had applied sustained discipline over long periods and arrived, eventually, at stability and then abundance. I let those stories soften something in me that had hardened through repeated disappointment. Then I applied the salt. And then, this is the rinsing phase. I let go of the outcome. Not passively, not irresponsibly, but in the way that Zebulun described the rinsing. You wash away what is no longer serving the preservation, the anxiety, the obsessive checking, the desperate energy that paradoxically repels the very thing you are trying to attract. The rinsing is not defeat. It is the final act of the ritual, the release that allows the preservation to hold. There is a man I want to tell you about now. His name was Navot, and Zebulun mentioned him as an example from his own past. A man he had tried to teach this to, who had refused to believe it could be this simple. Navot was a person of considerable talent. He could do things with numbers that made accountants uncomfortable. He had a mind like a blade. But Navot believed that the solution to his financial problems was complexity, that somewhere, hidden in some sophisticated strategy or obscure investment vehicle or cleverly timed maneuver, there was a secret door that would open onto a different life. He spent years looking for that door. He found sophisticated strategies and lost money on them. He found obscure vehicles and got stuck in them. He found cleverly timed maneuvers that were badly timed. Each failure deepened his certainty that he simply had not yet found the right complex solution. He never found it. Not because the solutions were wrong, necessarily, but because he was looking for complexity when the actual problem was decay. His foundation was rotting, and you cannot build a sophisticated structure on a rotting foundation, no matter how elegant the architecture. Zebulun said he had watched this pattern repeat across generations in his community and beyond it. Brilliant, capable people spending their lives pursuing complexity, while the simple, ancient technology of preservation sat ignored on the table in front of them. Salt, he said, has never been improved upon. It has been added to, decorated, combined with other things. But the fundamental mechanism, the way it binds to moisture and interrupts the process of rot, has not changed in 4,000 years. When something works that thoroughly for that long, it is not simple because it is primitive. It is simple because it is true. I have thought about that sentence more times than I can count. The things that are true tend to be simple. Not easy, simple. The difference is enormous. Simple means the core idea can be stated clearly. Easy means it requires no effort. The SALT principle is profoundly simple and genuinely difficult because it requires consistency and honesty and a willingness to see your own decay without flinching. Most people flinch. I flinched for years. But sitting across from an 81-year-old man with bark hands and a clay bowl of gray salt, something in me stopped flinching. Maybe it was the stillness of that early morning. Maybe it was his certainty, which was not the brittle certainty of someone who needs to be right, but the calm certainty of someone who has watched the same truth operate across decades and seen it never fail. Maybe I was simply finally ready. Here is what I want you to take from this. You have been looking, probably, for the thing that will change your situation, the right information, the right strategy, the right moment. And maybe some of those things matter. Maybe there is real knowledge you still need. But underneath all of that, underneath the strategies and the information and the timing, there is a more fundamental question. Where is the rot? Where are you losing what you have before it even has a chance to become something? Where are you watching decay happen and telling yourself you will address it later? Where have you quietly, gradually, incrementally lowered your expectations of yourself until the gap between who you are and who you intended to be has grown into something you can no longer quite look at directly? Those are not comfortable questions. They were not comfortable for me, but they are the right questions. And the SALT principle, this 4,000-year-old technology, preserved across generations because it works, because it has always worked, because the mechanism is true, begins with asking them honestly. Zebulun walked me to the door as the sun finally came up that morning. The city outside was starting to wake up, that gradual shuffling awakening of a place remembering what it is. He put a small paper packet in my hand. Salt. The same coarse, grayish-white, luminous salt from the clay bowl. Put it on your table, he said. Not in a drawer. On the table, where you can see it, so that every time you sit down to eat, you are asked the question. I still have it. It sits on my table now in a small dish, next to whatever else is there. Guests ask about it sometimes. I tell them it is a reminder. They usually nod politely and move on, but occasionally someone looks at it a little longer. And in their eyes, I see the same thing I felt that morning in Zebulun's kitchen. The sense that something important is being remembered. Something that was always known, that somehow got covered over by the noise and the complexity, and the relentless modern insistence that every solution must be new, must be sophisticated, must arrive in a format nobody has seen before. Sometimes the oldest things are old because they cannot be improved. Sometimes the salt is already on the table. You just have to stop letting it sit there unused. If this reached something in you, if some part of what Zebulun shared through me landed somewhere real, then I want to ask you to do one thing before you move on with your day. Not a complicated thing, the simplest possible act of beginning. Ask yourself the question he asked me that morning. Where is the rot? Not in a punishing way, not in a way that collapses into shame or overwhelm, but honestly, clearly, with the same calm that Zebulun brought to that clay bowl. The calm of someone who knows that identifying the problem is not the disaster, ignoring it is. And if you want to keep going, if you want to explore more of what this tradition preserved across thousands of years about money, time, legacy, and the architecture of a life that endures, then subscribe. Because this is only the first room in a very old house. There are more doors, and the SALT principle has a key for every one of them.